So I have read the passage that Beth just read over and over again this week, and I keep coming back to this image of a fox and a mother hen with her chicks. The sly fox, the cunning fox, the one from Dora the Explorer who's always trying to steal a backpack and eat the monkey. The slightly cringy politician disguised as a fox that slinks around, starting small fires, but not enough for us to want to do something about it, but just enough to keep a close eye on that person. The vulnerable mother hen, so desperately trying to protect her young chicks, willing to go up against a fox, even though it might cost her her life. This image of a powerful creature and a vulnerable animal keeps coming to my mind, and it never ends well. Perhaps this story is a foreshadow of what is to come when Jesus meets Herod. It certainly was a warning for Jesus to watch out. So last week I talked about Jesus in the wilderness and Jesus struggling with internal conflict. And we saw Jesus struggle with what he wanted, his earthly desires versus the path that God gave him. We saw a vulnerable Jesus. And this week we see a different side of Jesus, one that does not appear to be vulnerable, but confident, a bold Jesus. So bold, he sends a message to Herod that he has no time for him. He's busy completing his work. So just get my way. A Jesus so confident, he's willing to ignore the warnings that Herod is coming for him. And this bold Jesus is not afraid of authority. And Jesus is willing to risk what he believes in to keep on moving forwards, regardless of the consequence. A mother hen standing up for her chicks, regardless of the outcome. And I keep asking myself, is boldness a good quality? Is standing up to a powerful fox a good idea when you have no protection? Is sending a message to an authority figure, don't stand in my way, a good thing? And then I keep on thinking this week about all the people in the world that are brave, like Jesus, willing to cast aside the authorities in the world to get their work done. And this week I attended the funeral of Reverend Bill Phipps. And Bill was the 36th moderator of the United Church. He had a very loud voice for reconciliation with our Indigenous neighbors. He was a social activist for the environment and stood up for many causes he believed in. At his funeral, one of his good friends, Reverend Dr. Ted Reeves, said some powerful words about Bill. He said that Bill was the kind of person who would get up close in your face, really personal, and you never felt like your space was being invaded. And when Stephen Harper was running for prime minister and he wasn't being challenged, Bill stepped up and ran against him. And although Stephen snubbed the idea of an independent running with him, Bill went out of his way to congratulate him when he did win. Ted described Bill as respectful, courageous, prophetic, in respect to power. And Ted said he once saw Bill at the Stampede getting right up and close and personal with Ralph Klein and offered him some encouragement about doing the right thing. To me, Bill was a very brave man. He spoke even when it was difficult. He refused to let the powers that be get in his way of his very important work. Yet he was vulnerable. He didn't have an army backing him up. The media often ate Bill up and spit him out the other side. When Bill said that he didn't believe the resurrection was a physical act, they called him an atheist. And when he stood up for the LGBTQ community and extended an invitation to them to church, he was sent a lot of hate mail. Yet he forged on. And I started thinking this week about President Zelensky and how brave he's been. Zelensky has identified himself as target number 1 of Russia. But he and his family still remain in the Ukraine. He's become a global figurehead and focused on Ukrainian resistance. In February of last year, he took a sit against Putin and by shutting down the television channel controlled by a Ukrainian businessman that was pushing for a pro-Kremlin narrative about the Donbas. In April, with Putin building up his military along the Ukraine borders, Zelensky asked NATO for Ukraine to be admitted quickly into NATO. Asked NATO for Ukraine to be admitted. In November, he accused another Ukrainian businessman of collaborating with a Russian to stage a coup. And you might even recall Zelensky's telephone call with the then US President Donald Trump, who unsuccessfully pressured Zelensky to investigate campaign rival Joe Biden's son Hunter, which became the subject of Trump's first impeachment. Yes, Zelensky is brave and vulnerable. He has not backed down from authority. He has work to do, and nothing is going to get in his way, despite the warnings. Now, I'm sure I could go on for hours and hours about every brave man and woman in this world who dared to stand up to authority with no regard to outcome, because there are thousands and thousands who have worked so hard to make this world a better place. But let's get back to the passage for a second. So remember how I said a few minutes ago, the passage, we see a different side of Jesus, a brave Jesus, compared to the week before when Jesus was vulnerable and being tempted. Then I went on to talk about 2 people who made a difference in the world that were also brave. But the thing is, all these people have something in common. They are all vulnerable. They're like a mother hen confronting the fox. They all anticipated a challenge and suffering and did not back down. They all made themselves vulnerable for the sake of others. So you see, we cannot separate vulnerability with courage and strength. Even though we've been taught to see vulnerability as a sign of weakness, something to be avoided at all costs, is a part of being brave. In this passage, Jesus demonstrates that the vulnerability is essential to courage. In this passage, Jesus chooses the image of the hen gathering the brood of chicks to illustrate his love and concern for God's people. This image of a parent comes to mind. As any of you are parents out there, you know we are so desperately wanting to protect our children, no matter how old they are. Yet the minute we let them out of our sight, we are completely vulnerable. I might have told some of you this, but just a few weeks ago, Kaya got her driver's license and we were so thrilled. No more chauffeuring her around, no more juggling our schedules to see who pick her up from school. Yet at the same time, I was so desperately wanting to hold her close and never let her go. And yet the very first time I let her drive to school, she crashed the car. She wasn't hurt, so the car's repaired. But my point is that there's actually no way we can protect our children from all the threats of this life. And we, as parents, are left vulnerable. And we're left with a level of suffering that we simply wouldn't endure if we had not bound ourselves to our children, if we did not love our children with our whole hearts. And I imagine God feels very much the same way about us. Although God warns us, we still do our own thing. The image of mother's hands vulnerability spurs our courage and nourishes our strength. Simply because you can and will do things for those you love that you simply would not or could not do for yourself. And so Jesus continues on to Jerusalem, not to prove himself fearless or a hero, not to be a sacrifice for our sins or even combat death, but rather Jesus marches to Jerusalem, embraces the cross that awaits him there out of profound love for the people around him, a mother's fierce love that will stop at nothing to protect her children. So as illustrated, there's this passage, we not only see a brave Jesus, but a vulnerable Jesus. A Jesus who embraces who he was called to be for the sake of those he loved, and therefore inviting us to be who we are called to be for the sake of those around us. Yes, he's vulnerable to Herod's power, but he doesn't care. He's on a mission to protect his children no matter what the cost. And I think this concept of being brave and vulnerable can be applied directly to our church and to our faith. What if, instead of running from things in this world we are afraid of, if we started running towards them? Probably the number one thing that we're all afraid of is change. Do you agree? This place, this church is comfortable, it's clean, it conforms to what church looks like, it has pews. I'm standing up here, you're standing there, there's organization, it's not chaotic. It makes us feel good to be here. And then I preach a sermon on being brave and vulnerable. And it takes you out of your box a little bit. It makes you feel uncomfortable because I'm probably going to ask you to do something you don't want to do. Because we probably don't really want to stand up to our enemy and be vulnerable. We don't really want to shake up church because it makes us feel uncomfortable. We don't really want change because that means we have to feel vulnerable. Yet if we don't, what happens? What happens to Parkdale if we just stay the same when the world around us is evolving? What if Bill or Zelensky or Jesus had decided not to be brave? What if Martin Luther King Jr. or Pope John Paul or even Joan of Arc decided not to be brave? I, for one, love Parkdale. When I think of it as my home, when I think of you, I'm your shepherd, and I am willing to do anything to ensure that Parkdale does not shrink into the secular world. So I will be brave. I will stand up here every week, making you feel a little uncomfortable about living out your faith, about standing up for the marginalized. I will propose radical ideas for this church to ensure that we are growing with society. And I will request change over and over and over again. Like a mother hen, I'm willing to die for her chicks. I'm willing to die of hard work to ensure this church survives. Does that sound a little crazy? Would you rather have a minister who just wants a paycheck and to be comfortable, or someone who shakes you up a little bit? So we need to start being brave and vulnerable with each other so we can start building a stronger community. What if you knew the person beside you suffers from anxiety? What would you do so differently? What happens if you knew the person behind you didn't have enough money for food last week? What would you do? What if you knew the person in the back row just really needed a hug today because they've had the worst week ever? Yet how often are we willing to be brave and vulnerable and ask for help or tell people what we're thinking or feeling? As a church, we need to be vulnerable and brave. We need to be willing to have these hard conversations about who we really are and maybe stop trying to be something we think we should be. I stand up here every Sunday and I say our mission statement is to build connection, live out our faith, and stand up for justice. But I keep on wondering, is this really who we are? Is this my vision or your vision? Do we really want to build relationships with each other, or do we just want to gather on Sunday mornings and say hi? Do we really want to live our faith out? Or would you rather just sit comfortably in these pews on Sunday morning? Is our mission really to change the world? Or would we rather just help people in need by giving to the food bank? And there's no right or wrong answer to this. There's no right or wrong congregation. There's no right or wrong church. We can be proud of who we are, but we need to be honest. We need to be brave and vulnerable. And this is what change looks like. So let's go back to my original questions. Is boldness a good quality? Is standing up to a powerful fox a good idea when you have no protection? Is sending a message of don't stand in my way to those in power a good thing? I honestly wish I could say no. I wish I could say, sit in your recliner and be comfortable. It's enough. Because then you would not have to be vulnerable. And I probably wouldn't have anxiety. But if we choose just to sit in our recliners and sit back and listen, then we will just be absorbed into secular worlds. We have to stand up to the fox, even if that means we all suffer a bit. We have to send a message to the world. Don't stand in my way, even if that means we're vulnerable. Because we cannot sit here idly and do nothing. I'll write the men's prayer.